Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, of course, I would like to once again congratulate, in your person, Alexander Alexandrovich, the staff of the Primakov National Research Institute of World Economy and International Relations of the Russian Academy of Sciences on its 70th anniversary, which was celebrated in April. And once again, I want to wish our colleagues good health, new creative successes, inspiration, and all the very best. I value yet another opportunity to speak at the Primakov readings, which traditionally have gathered a very representative lineup of participants and officials, scientists, and experts from Russia and many countries around the world. Participation in this forum is a kind of tribute that we pay to Ilyin Maximovich Primakov, his outstanding personality, his rich creative legacy, and his ideas, which fully retain their relevance in our work today. It has been said more than once, including from this rostrum, that back in the mid-1990s, when the West was anticipating the onset of a whole era of its global dominance, Primakov not only discerned, foresaw, and formulated the imminent arrival of multipolarity, but also began to steer the Russian foreign policy ship precisely into the channel of the emerging, fairer, polycentric world order. Well, that is a metaphor, but in practical work, this direction was expressed, among other things, in the literal turnaround, but not of a ship, but of an airplane, as you know, when he realized that he was flying to a country that had just unleashed another aggression. Life itself subsequently proved the accuracy of his forecast, simultaneously refuting the superficial assessments of the apologists of the end of history, who promoted the lack of alternatives to the ultra-liberal development model. 3 decades ago, in his programmatic article, International Relations on the Eve of the 21st Century, Ilyin Maximovich emphasized, and I quote, "No single state possesses sufficient power to single-handedly cope with a legion of problems. With a massive delay, this understanding is beginning, not without difficulty, to pave its way among individual representatives of the political and intellectual elites of the West." About a year ago, Secretary of State Marco Rubio publicly stated, and I quote, "The US can no longer solve world problems alone." Moreover, at a meeting in February 2025 in Riyadh, when, at the initiative of the Trump administration, we met with Marco Rubio in Riyadh in February 2025, the then National Security Advisor Mike Waltz and Yuri Ushakov were there. And there, Marco Rubio, presenting the foreign policy of the Trump administration's second term, articulated several very important theses, primarily regarding the need for interaction based on the recognition of each other's national interests. Moreover, it is imperative to cooperate, not to miss a chance in those situations where these national interests converge, and when they diverge, which happens in most cases, to prevent the degradation of this divergence into a confrontation, especially a hot one. It is another matter that the realization of the inability to ensure sole leadership has not yet led to the readiness of the United States, and of course the West as a whole, to accept the realities of objectively emerging multipolarity. They prefer to strengthen their weakening positions primarily by pulling to their side, forcing the countries of the global majority to play their game through sanctions, bans, threats, and illegitimate measures of a different nature. And, of course, the West still does not want to comply, just as it has never fully complied, with the generally recognized norms of international law, primarily those embodied in the Charter of the United Nations, when everyone, signing and ratifying the Charter, pledged to observe these norms in their entirety, totality, and interconnection. This includes the sovereign equality of states, non-interference in their internal affairs, respect for the right of peoples to self-determination, and respect and guarantees of human rights regardless, quoting the Charter, of race, sex, language, and religion. I quoted this on purpose, so you will understand that language and religion in Ukraine are by no means protected under the UN Charter, but are under the control of a neo-Nazi junta. The West looks upon this in silence. All these principles that I have just listed, the West either does not observe or observes selectively, as it needs to advance its interests at a specific stage, including to the detriment, and usually to the detriment, of other participants in international relations, to the detriment of the integrity of the international law system. When Kosovo is declared independent without any referendum, in the absence of any conflict, of any hostilities, that is all fine. When in response to a coup d'etat, in response to the dispatch of armed militants to storm the Crimean parliament, Crimeans go to a referendum and make a decision to reunite with Russia. This is categorically rejected, because here it is not the right to self-determination, but territorial integrity. This duplicity has repeatedly manifested itself recently in relation to Greenland. When the official spokesperson for the UN Secretary-General was asked at a press conference what he thought about President Trump declaring his policy regarding Greenland, he replied, "Well, we advocate for this problem to be resolved on the basis of the principles of international law, the territorial integrity of Denmark, and the right of the nation to self-determination." Our journalist asks him, couldn't this exact same formula be applied to Crimea and to Ukraine as a whole? He says, no, there it's only territorial integrity. This is the representative of the Secretary-General. By the way, the entire upper echelon there, all the key posts that influence the work of the UN and the entire UN system are members of the North Atlantic Alliance. Citizens, I mean. We see in such behavior of our Western colleagues the main reason for the game, without rules or the power play, that the Western minority is trying to impose on the global majority. A feature of the current moment can also be called the fact that the West does not disdain changing its attitude on the fly, even to the notorious rules with which, until recently, it tried to substitute international law. As soon as the West felt that free trade, fair competition, the inviolability of property, and the unhindered movement of capital allowed the potential of new development centers in Asia, Africa, and Latin America to be unlocked, they immediately turned the dollar and other global currencies into weapons, unleashed sanction and tariff wars, and began confiscating gold and foreign exchange reserves and other material assets. Having jeopardized all the achievements of its own brainchild, economic globalization, and its very future, the West is also destroying the foundation of the international security system that took decades to create. NATO categorically refuses to fulfill not only its oral, as they say, promises to the leadership of the Soviet Union and the new Russia, but even the political obligations contained on paper, not oral, but on paper, signed by the top leaders of Western countries together with us at the summits of the Organization for Security and Cooperation. In Europe, above all, they categorically reject the principle of equal and indivisible security. According to this principle, as enshrined in the aforementioned documents, security is indivisible. No one has the right to strengthen their security at the expense of infringing on the security of others. No single country, group of countries, or organization has the right to claim dominance in the Euro-Atlantic space. In my opinion, you can't put it any clearer. And the fact that NATO is engaged precisely in its dominance, or rather, its advancement, I think, does not need to be explained to this audience. For many years, Russia has been dealing with the irresponsible course of the Atlantic community, geopolitical expansion to the east, right up to our borders. But we are not indifferent to NATO's dangerous attempts to achieve global military and military technological superiority and the aggressive expansion of the zone of its interests to the entire Eurasia and the Asia-Pacific region. Not so long ago, but already probably it can be considered a long time ago, the previous NATO Secretary-General Stoltenberg was asked at some press conference when he began to talk about Indo-Pacific strategies, and they asked, but isn't NATO supposed to be defending the territory of its member states? He says, yes, without even blinking, but in the current period, he said, the threat to the territorial integrity of our members stems from the Taiwan Strait, from the South China Sea, from Southeast Asia, and so on. They are actively making themselves at home there, as you know. We can talk about this in more detail later. Among recent manifestations of policies undermining international stability, of course, are the U.S. actions in Venezuela under the pretext of combating drug trafficking. All this resulted in the forceful seizure of the legitimately elected president and culminated in the banal placing under American control of the most profitable oil sector of the Venezuelan economy, which President Trump officially stated with figures just recently. When aggressive offensive lines hit an obstacle or reach a dead end, the West remembers diplomacy, the importance of finding compromises and mutually beneficial solutions. Russia supports reaching an agreement on the cessation of hostilities between the U.S. and Iran. We support the negotiations that have begun, and we are ready to assist in drafting a comprehensive long-term agreement between these two countries, and of course, in the context of broader regulation involving their neighbors, if our good offices are in demand. We hope, of course, that the resumption of free navigation through the Strait of Hormuz will benefit the energy and food security of the countries of the global south, and the stabilization of the military-political situation in the Persian Gulf zone may well become a pretext for launching a broad dialogue on a new architecture of security and cooperation in this strategic region and in the Middle East as a whole. Very recently, in late May, Russia continued our long-standing efforts to facilitate this process and updated the concept of creating a collective security system in the Persian Gulf zone. We distributed it to the coastal states. We understand that it depends primarily on them how interesting and practically realizable this will be. But we allow and assume, as we did when promoting this concept many years ago, the participation of other neighboring countries, as well as countries that are not regional players, if regional participants are interested in this. I hope that representatives of the scientific and expert community will also contribute to formulating the parameters of such a collective security concept in the Gulf. The concept implies, very briefly, step-by-step progress towards unlocking the remaining conflict situations in the region, developing confidence-building measures among coastal countries, and pairing the interests of regional states with the interests of international players who are genuinely involved in stabilization and facilitating the development of cooperation in the Gulf zone and the Middle East as a whole. Of course, achieving these goals will require considerable diplomatic skill and, I will add, the diligence of all interested parties. In exactly the same way, efforts are needed today for a fair settlement of the long-standing Arab-Israeli conflict, which for decades has been a major source of regional and international tension, and which is now carefully being pushed to the back burner of the global agenda. Obviously, unraveling this conflict knot is possible only by eliminating historical injustice towards the Palestinian people, allowing them finally and helping them to realize their right, legally affirmed in the UN, to create their own independent, viable state while reliably ensuring Israel's legitimate security interests. Of course, one can talk for a long time, and this is happening, about how the facts on the ground make such a prospect very vague, if not impossible. However, Not only international law, but also moral rightness in this issue is on the side of the Palestinians, and this must not be forgotten. Currently, we are observing how, in essence, rejecting all UN resolutions that were adopted on this topic, and even bringing into question and under threat the resolution adopted last autumn, which approved Donald Trump's plan for the Gaza Strip, even without any mention of the West Bank of the Jordan River. But this resolution, which assumed a completely new approach, did not mention the creation of a single state, and cared only about the condition of the Gaza Strip and those who live there. Even it is now running up against an insurmountable reality. We and the PRC abstained and did not apply to this only because our Arab friends, including the Palestinians themselves, strongly asked us to. The entire experience of centuries-old diplomacy speaks of one thing. The golden rule for the long-term settlement of conflicts is the unconditional eradication of their root causes. By the way, the eradication of the root causes of conflicts is one of the points of the initiative of President Xi Jinping, which he put forward in February 2023 on global security issues. The task of eliminating root causes concerns for us, first and foremost, the Ukrainian crisis, which was artificially generated by the West in the context of the very expansion I already spoke about towards Russian borders. After many years of what turned out to be pointless and fruitless exhortations on our part, it is necessary to realize a simple truth. Russia's adversaries cannot endlessly and with impunity ignore our clearly expressed warnings about the inadmissibility of creating unacceptable threats to the national security of our country and the violation of all possible obligations regarding the legitimate rights of the Russian and Russian-speaking population of Ukraine. The freedom to use the Russian language, the freedom of Russian language media, Russian and Russian culture, the canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church. I am convinced that resolving the situation around Ukraine by political and diplomatic methods is still entirely possible. President Putin has spoken about this more than once. This requires specific, legally binding security guarantees based on the principle of its indivisibility, including ensuring Russia's security on its western borders. At the same time, the West must understand, and the sooner the better, that plans for military, political, geo-economic, and I might add, ideological expansion into the zone of Russia's vital interests must be abandoned. I have already spoken about ensuring the rights of our compatriots. This is an absolutely inalienable condition that should not be part of the bargaining sets. This is a duty, independent of anything else. The UN Charter, and by the way, the Constitution of Ukraine guarantees the rights of the Russian and other national minorities. It has not been repealed yet, although the adopted laws directly contradict it. In August of last year, the leaders of Russia and the US reached a number of understandings regarding political ways out of the Ukrainian crisis. We remain committed to these understandings. By and large, the American side was their author, and President Putin only gave his consent to the proposals voiced to us, primarily after carefully working through them. The ball today is not on our side of the field, although they increasingly try to pass it to us from offside, to use the language of the currently popular World Cup. That won't work. For Russia, the issue is of a fundamental nature, and we will certainly not trade for any temporary intermediate solutions, let alone accept ultimatums dictated by someone. And it is important for certain figures in countries to the west of Russia to keep this in mind, those who are pumping the Kiev regime with weapons and simultaneously trying, probably having already buried the results of the enclave for themselves, trying to impose their vision of negotiations as a process of formalizing Russia's capitulation. Such behavior does not reflect well on those who claim to be called politicians, And of course, such behavior will definitely not lead to positive results. Nevertheless, as a responsible power, Russia remains open to dialogue with everyone who is ready to conduct it honestly, which is the main thing, and on the basis of the principles of mutual respect and equality. And until Europe, or the entire West, has matured to this point, we are working and will continue to work with the global majority on a positive agenda. There is a vast amount of work here. This is confirmed by Russian-Chinese relations, in particular, the relations of comprehensive partnership and strategic interaction. They can be considered a model of equitable, mutually beneficial cooperation between two major powers. The foreign policy tandem of Moscow and Beijing acts as a significant factor in maintaining international stability and offers a model for a secure and just future. The contours of such a model have repeatedly been outlined in the documents of Russian-Chinese summits, and once again, they were detailed in the joint declaration adopted a month ago by the leaders of Russia and China during President Putin's state visit. The declaration on the establishment of a multipolar world and the new era of international relations. I have no doubt that the expert community paid attention to this important document. I will also note our relations with India, relations of especially privileged strategic partnership. They also have a rich history. We continue their comprehensive development, and at the same time, we advocate for the revitalization of the Troika, BRICS, Russia, India, China. This format took shape about 30 years ago, again on the initiative of Yevgeny Maximovich Primakov, and became the core for the formation of BRICS. BRICS emerged from the example of how the principles of sovereign equality and mutually beneficial cooperation can be implemented at the multilateral level. Their philosophy is close and understandable to all states that seek to pursue independent foreign policy courses and promote primarily national interests. For everyone who does not accept the concept of leaders and followers entrenched in Western-centric alliances and mechanisms, BRICS has emerged as a very interesting. And in our associations, cooperation is built on the basis of mutual respect and a readiness to look for consensus solutions even when they are hard to find. Such cases do happen, and quite often. But once found, such solutions provide a reliable guarantee of upholding the common interest. That is exactly why the number of those wishing to join the work of the SCO and BRICS is steadily growing. These are the countries of Central and Southeast Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And we look with optimism to the future of these associations, whose composition reflects the realities of a multipolar world much more accurately than, for example, the Group of Seven. Not to mention the fact that we are not friends with someone against someone else, but are engaged in the development issues of each participant and everyone together. If we analyze the results of the Evian summit, the G7 is still stuck in the paradigm of containing Russia and China, either with us or against us. This is a well-known principle, and it tries to dictate its unilateral approaches to the world. And unilateral approaches, as Yevgeny Maximovich wrote, only provoke rivalry and ultimately a chaotic, unpredictable drift in international relations. I have already had occasion to say that one of the basic rules for the functioning of a fairer, multipolar world order is that it is important to find regional solutions to regional problems. A special role, without a doubt, among regional issues belongs to the Eurasian continent, where several ancient civilizations are located and enormous resources and potentials are concentrated. President Putin's initiative on forming a greater Eurasian partnership and creating an architecture of Eurasian security is designed to contribute to the arrangement of Eurasia on a modern, rational basis. The upcoming, already fourth, Minsk conference will be devoted to this topic, where the Russian-Belarusian proposal on developing a Eurasian Charter of Diversity and Multipolarity will be discussed. I want to emphasize that we do not claim a monopoly. We are ready to consider any other initiatives on the development of the Eurasian continent, including within the framework of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, within the framework of Kazakhstan's well-known initiative, the Conference on Interaction and Confidence-Building Measures in Asia. But Eurasianism must, of course, receive some kind of formalization in world affairs, because it is the only continent, it is the largest, but it is the only one, where there is no pan-continental structure. There are many regional and sub-regional ones, but there is no pan-continental structure. In Africa and Latin America, there are also many integration associations, but in both places, there is a pan-continental framework, the African Union and the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States. I want to emphasize that the initiatives I spoke about, President Putin's initiatives, do not exclude the participation of a single state or a single association located on the Eurasian continent that is ready to work in good faith towards building the foundations for common prosperity and stability. We will be glad if the participants of the Primakov readings also play their role and make their contribution to this process, first of all, in promoting the intellectual component of these initiatives. As President Putin noted not so long ago, speaking at the credential presentation ceremony in January of this year in the Kremlin, I quote, "Peace does not come by itself. It is built, and what's more, every day. Therefore, the task of both classical and scientific diplomacy is precisely to find calibrated solutions to the key problems of our time through painstaking daily work. I am convinced that our forum is taking place at exactly that historical moment. Thank you very much."